Hi everyone, and welcome to Canadian Redneck Channel. My name is Dave, and today we have part 2 of our 444 engine rebuild series. The engine is all stripped and ready to start putting back together. I took the block and pressure washed it all off because it was really messy. I had like 40-50 years of oil and dirt on it. And so now we're ready to start. We'll start off by putting our sleeves in. So I'll get the camera set up so you can see what we're doing, and we'll get started. We're ready to start putting our sleeves in now. I've taken and cleaned all the cavities at the top where the sleeve fits down in, and the O-ring grooves at the bottom, just like a flat blade screwdriver. Scrape out any carbon or dirt and wipe them clean with a rag. And so we are ready now to put our O-rings in, sleeve O-rings. They go down in a groove towards the bottom of the sleeve, and you just take them and fish them into place into the groove in the block. There. With the O-ring in place, we're ready to put our sleeve in, but that has to slide by that dry rubber O-ring, so that'll be fairly grippy. We've got to use some lubrication. We don't want to use an oil-based lubrication because it'll can damage the rubber O-ring. So we have dish soap, just regular dish soap, and we'll put a little drizzle on there. Smear it all the way around. Make sure you have it right to the bottom because that's where it's going to contact the O-ring first. There we go. And then carefully set that in place. There we are. And it should just pop right down in place. Oh, but it doesn't always. Okay. Sometimes you get one that's going to be a little stubborn. So just, a piece of wood so you're not going to damage the sleeve, and carefully tap it to get it started by the O-ring. There we go. And once it's started, it should just pop into place like that. And you got to be careful of your fingers. You don't want to get them around the lip of the sleeve because you can pinch the hell out of your fingers. And then we do the same thing for the next 3. So we've got all the sleeves in. We're ready now to flip the block over, and we'll get started on putting the bearings in so we can put the crank in. We're ready to start laying the crank now. So I've started by cleaning out all the journals on the crank, making sure they're wiped clean and so on, ready for the bearings to go in. And then we lay the main bearings. I'm going to start with the one with the thrust washers on it. You make sure that the oil hole is lined up with the hole in the block, and the little tab is in the notch. You just slide it down into the journal and make sure that it's relatively even on both ends. Then you do the same with each of the other 4 plain bearings. Okay, now I'm going to put some oil on each of these bearings. On this back one, make sure I get some on the thrust surfaces also. Just a nice coat of oil so it has some lubrication in there when the engine starts. Now, when we're installing the crank, we have to make sure that our timing marks on the crank gear line up with the 1 dot on the cam and the 2 dots on the idler gear. There we are. 2 dots on the crank, 1 dot on the crank, 1 dot on the cam, 2 dots on the idler gear. Perfect. On the block is number 1 through 5 to correspond with the main caps that go on each place. And on the cap, there's a number on each one. There's a little shoulder off of the center that has the number on it that corresponds for each place in the block. We install the bearing in the cap just the same way we did in the block. Make sure the tab in the bearing matches with the notch in the cap. And try to put it in so it's relatively even. And then our number on the cap goes towards the number on the block. Ah yes, we want some oil on that. And I don't know if it helps or not, but I like to put a little oil down the oil passages in the crank. It gives it a little bit more oil in there when the engine starts. Carefully set it into place. Get our bolt started. We'll crank them down in a minute. And again, we carry on and do the same thing with each of the other 4. Okay, now we'll just snug these up. We're ready to torque our main caps now. Manual calls for 70 to 75 foot-pounds. So I'm going to do that in 2 steps. I'll start off at 40 and then jumping on up to 75. Our next step is to assemble our piston and connecting rod assemblies ready to install in the engine. Now, since these are a British engine, the normal rules don't apply. It doesn't really matter which side the numbers are on the connecting rod. It's these notches for the bearing tabs that you look for. And they go to the cam side, which in our case is going to be to the right when the engine is pointed to when the front of the engine is away from us. So we'll put that in with those bearing tabs to the right, and the front of the engine is straight ahead. So our piston is marked front, which would be this way, so that goes away from us. We set that on our connecting rod, get a little oil on our piston pin, just so it slides in nicely. There we are. Before we push the piston pin all the way home, we're going to put our lock ring in the other side. Make sure that it's in the groove well. And we shove that the rest of the way in. And our lock ring goes in this side. And again, make sure that it's snapped down in the groove. Now we install our piston rings, and they come in a long envelope, and it has them marked for each groove that they go in. And so we'll start with ring groove 5, the bottom one, and work our way up. And groove 5, of course, is one of our oil rings. It's got 2 oil rings and 3 compression. And there's no mark or anything, and the ring is symmetrical. So that means it doesn't matter which side goes up. So we carefully put it on the top, spread that, get it down by this 4th groove because it wants to go in there. Come on, there we go. There. Get it down in the bottom groove. Same thing with ring 4, no top or bottom. There we are. Our 3rd ring is marked top on the top side of it, obviously. Now it has a little step on the back side of the ring, and so the open side of that step goes to the top. When it starts going up against compression, the compression will slide back there and push the ring out tight against the cylinder. So if you find one with a step and it isn't marked top, you know which way to go. There we are. We'll get this there, down to the 3rd. And the 2nd ring is identical to the 3rd, marked top, so on it goes. The top ring is unmarked and is symmetrical, so it doesn't matter which way it goes. There. And that has our piston and connecting rod assembly all assembled, ready to drop in the engine. You just repeat that 3 more times for the other 3 connecting rods. We're ready to install our piston and rod assemblies now. So the first thing is we're going to give all the cylinders a good coat of oil. Going to rub that around, make sure it's coated all the way to the bottom, so that there's no dry spots in there when the engine starts. So you want to install the connecting rods with the crank journals all the way down. So we're going to start with 2 and 3 because they're already down. And so we start by putting our connecting rod bearing in the connecting rod. Same way as with the mains. You make sure the tab on the bearing is in the notch on the connecting rod. Just slide them down in and make sure both ends are relatively even. Give that a little coat of oil. This one is number 3. Then we want to get a good stagger on the rings, meaning you don't want the gaps, the openings, all at the same place. So we stagger those around the piston so they're all in different places. Now, I don't like to have the rings, the openings, right at the center line of the piston, between the wrist pinholes, right at the center line, because that's where the most pressure is. I don't think that's a good idea to have the opening there. And so it's best to put them around the sides. And we use our piston ring compressor. It's got little dents, I guess, on the side that stick out to hold it on top of the cylinder. So you make sure you put those towards the bottom. Then we slip that on over the rings and tighten it up. There we are. And that will compress the rings into the piston so that they don't catch on the cylinder when you put it down in. We carefully set that down in the cylinder. There we are. And then I just use a hammer and tap my hand on the top of it. Put the handle on the piston. Just light tap with my hand until the piston slides in. Then it's just the same process with number 2. We'll make sure we get the connecting rods wiped out nice and clean. Make sure that the bearing is clean. Don't want any dirt or anything behind the bearing, because that'll make a high spot on the bearing where it'll be tight. And that's not good. You don't want it tight on the crank, because that'll cause premature wear on the bearing and can damage the crank also. Now we're going to turn the block over so we can get to those rods. I'm going to carefully grab a hold of them and pull them up to the crank. There's one. And there's 2. And just like the rod, we're going to wipe the cap out, make sure it's nice and clean. Carefully set the bearing into place in the cap. This one is number 2. I like putting a little oil in that oil port in the crank. Just ensures there's some oil in there for startup, and again we wipe some oil on the bearing. Make sure we have our tab side going towards the cam. And now we're going to turn the crank 180 degrees, ready to put in the next 2 pistons. For our connecting rod bolts, our manual says 40 to 45 foot-pounds. I'm just going to do that in one step. I'm going to just snug them up lightly first, but then torque them. Alright, then we'll turn our engine back so we can reach the other 2. Turn the engine back so our timing marks would line up. Again, that keeps our engine at top dead center number 1. Once I've checked the gasket, determined which way it goes, then I use a couple of studs to hold it in place while I set the cylinder head on and get a couple of bolts started. That way we're sure that the gasket is in place with the cylinder head. The center head bolt goes through the center carrier for the rocker arms, which is less than ideal, but is what it is. It's less than ideal because you'll have to loosen this again after the head is all torqued to assemble the rocker arm assembly. And then after you've heated things up, you need to remove the rocker arms and thus this bolt again to retorque the head after it's warmed up and everything's seated. And then you'll have to put the rocker arm, reassemble the rocker arms, put them back on, and reset the valve gap. But is what it is. You just gotta deal with what cards you're played, I guess. So our manual calls for 75 to 80 foot-pounds on the head bolts, and we're going to do that in 2 steps. I'm going to go 55 and then 80. We're going to now install the injector pump gear. We can tell the engine is at top dead center number 1 because our 1 dot on the crank gear lines up with the 1 dot on the cam gear. The double dot on the crank gear lines up with the 2 dots on the idler gear, and then the 1 dot on the idler gear is pointing toward the injector pump. So we find on the injector pump there's 2 dots on either side of a valley, and that is what matches up to that. And then we've got our notch in the end of the injector pump here, and our pin in the gear goes into that. So we'll line that up here. This is going to have to turn up a little bit. There we are. We're pretty close. I'm just going to take a punch and I can get in that hole and move a little bit more. There we are. I think we should be pretty good. The bolts will start, we know. Now the engine is officially in time. We can roll the engine over and don't have to worry about it anymore. Other than we'll need to mark our spot when we put the front cover and pulley on, so that we have a reference point for timing the valve, or sorry, for setting the valves. Okay, we're ready to set our valves here now on the cylinder head. Manual calls for 20 thousandths clearance, hot or cold. So we'll use our feeler gauge, and yeah, that's tight, which isn't a surprise because they had to plane 12 thousandths off this head to get a flat surface. Okay. There you go. And you just set it so you can feel a little bit of drag on the feeler gauge. Not tight, just a little bit of drag. Alright, so that's number one. And so we're going to rotate the engine now 180 degrees, and that'll bring us up to top dead center on number three, ready to do them. These glow plugs are wired in series, so there's one a wire that goes between 1 and 2 at the base of the glow plug, and one goes between 3 and 4 at the base of the glow plug. Then we put our insulators on each one. On number one, we have our wire that comes out to ground. Which goes onto that bolt there that holds the cover over the injector pump gear. Next we have our wire that goes between number 2 and number 3 out at the top of the glow plug, or the outside edge of the glow plug. Harness is here to put the power wire into it. We're at the stage now where we're ready to put on the rear seal retainer and oil pan, and because of how this one is sitting in the mount for the engine stand, I got to get it out of the engine stand before I can get that rear seal retainer on. So we'll call this the end of part 2. And in the next stage, we'll be pulling the engine out of the engine stand and putting it back in the tractor. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave that in the comment section below. And please like the video, subscribe to my channel, and as always, have a great day.